Venezuela found out the hard way. Let me take you back to July 29, 2024, a date that, on the surface, seemed like just another chapter in Venezuela's long-running political drama. The country's electoral council announced that Nicolas Maduro had won a third term in a tightly contested presidential election. The opposition cried foul. The United States immediately denounced the results as fraudulent, and within days, the Biden administration was floating the idea of recognizing opposition leader Edmundo Gonzalez as the legitimate president. The media ran with the Venezuela's dictatorship steals another election, the people rise up, and the free world must act. But here's the thing, if you've followed my work over the past 2 decades, you know I don't take official narratives at face value. I've been in the rooms where these decisions are made. I've seen how geopolitical chess moves are dressed up as moral crusades. And what's unfolding in Venezuela right now isn't just about democracy versus authoritarianism. It's about something far the death throes of American unipolar dominance and the brutal, messy birth of a multipolar world. Venezuela found out the hard way what happens when a small country dares to defy the global hegemon, and the lesson should terrify anyone who still believes in the myth of American benevolence. Let me tell you what's really going on. The official what they want you to believe. The story, as it's being sold to the American public, goes like Venezuela is a failed state, a dictatorship that has impoverished its people through corruption and mismanagement. Maduro's regime is illegitimate, propped up by Cuban intelligence, Russian mercenaries, and Chinese loans. The July election was a sham. Opposition candidates were barred, votes were manipulated, and the people's will was crushed. The United States, as the leader of the free world, has a moral obligation to support democracy by recognizing the opposition's claim to power, imposing sanctions, and, if necessary, backing a transition of authority. The evidence? Well, the opposition says so. The U.S. State Department says so. The Organization of American States says so. Even the European Union, after some initial hesitation, fell in line. The numbers don't add up. They claim Maduro's 51% to Gonzalez's 44% is statistically impossible given the opposition's massive rallies. Exit polls, conducted by friendly firms, showed Gonzalez winning by a landslide. The regime, they say, is desperate, cornered, and lashing out. And then there's the humanitarian angle. Venezuela's economy has collapsed, hyperinflation, mass emigration, food shortages. The U.S. frames this as entirely Maduro's fault, a consequence of socialist mismanagement. The solution? More sanctions, more pressure, more isolation until the regime collapses or is overthrown. But here's the problem with this: it's not true. Not in the way they're telling it, anyway. Deconstructing the what's really happening. Let's start with the election. The opposition's claim that the results are fraudulent rests on 2 exit polls and statistical anomalies. The exit polls, conducted by firms like Edison Research, showed Gonzalez winning by 30 points. But here's what they don't tell: exit polls in Venezuela are notoriously unreliable. The opposition controls the polling firms, the sample sizes are skewed toward urban areas where they're strongest, and the regime's supporters, particularly in rural and working-class neighborhoods, are far less likely to participate in such surveys. The Carter Center, which has observed Venezuelan elections for years, has repeatedly noted that while the process is flawed, it's not systemically rigged in the way the U.S. claims. Then there's the statistical argument. The opposition points to irregularities in the vote tallies, sudden jumps in Maduro's numbers, unexplained delays in reporting. But independent analysts, including those at the University of California, Berkeley, have found that the results fall within expected statistical patterns for a close election. The real anomaly? The fact that Maduro, who has presided over an economic collapse, still managed to win 51% of the vote. That doesn't suggest fraud, it suggests that, despite everything, a significant portion of the Venezuelan population still supports him. Why? Because the opposition isn't the angelic democratic force the U.S. makes it out to be. The opposition in Venezuela is a fractured coalition of elites, former Chavistas, and hardline anti-communists. Some genuinely want democracy. Others want to return to the pre-Chavez era, when Venezuela's oil wealth flowed into the pockets of a small oligarchy. The U.S. has backed this coalition for years, not because it's a paragon of democratic virtue, but because it's willing to play ball with Washington. The 2002 coup attempt against Chavez? The U.S. supported it. The 2019 humanitarian aid stunt, where the opposition tried to force trucks across the Colombian border to provoke a crisis? The U.S. orchestrated it. The 2020 Bay of Piglets invasion, where a ragtag group of mercenaries tried to overthrow Maduro? The U.S. had its fingerprints all over it. And let's talk about those sanctions. The U.S. frames them as targeted measures against the regime's elites. In reality, they're a full-blown economic blockade. Since 2017, the U.S. has imposed over 900 sanctions on Venezuela, cutting it off from the global financial system, seizing its assets, and making it nearly impossible to sell oil. The result? A humanitarian catastrophe. The UN estimates that sanctions have contributed to the deaths of at least 100,000 Venezuelans. The U.S. claims this is necessary to starve the regime, but what it's really doing is starving the people. And here's the it's not working. Maduro is still in power. The military is still loyal. The opposition is still divided. All the sanctions have done is push Venezuela deeper into the arms of Russia and China. Which brings us to the real reason the U.S. is so desperate to remove geopolitics. The geopolitical why Venezuela matters. Venezuela isn't just another Latin American country. It's the world's largest proven oil reserve, bigger than Saudi Arabia's. It's a gateway to the Caribbean, a potential staging ground for Russian and Chinese influence in the Western Hemisphere. And most importantly, it's a test case for American power in an era when that power is fading. Let me put this in perspective. For the past 30 years, the United States has operated under the assumption that it can shape the world in its image. The end of the Cold War was supposed to usher in a new world order where liberal democracy and free markets reigned supreme. Countries that resisted, like Iraq, Libya, Syria, were crushed. But that era is over. Russia and China have spent the last 2 decades building alternatives to America: the BRICS bloc, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the New Development Bank. They're creating a parallel financial system, a parallel military alliance, a parallel world order where the US dollar isn't king and NATO isn't the final arbiter of global security. Venezuela is ground zero for this new world. Since 2019, when the U.S. recognized Juan Guaidó as interim president in a failed coup attempt, Venezuela has become a battleground between the old unipolar order and the emerging multipolar one. Russia has sent military advisors and Wagner Group mercenaries to protect Maduro. China has extended billions in loans, secured oil deals, and helped Venezuela evade U.S. sanctions. Iran has provided drones and technical expertise. And the U.S.? It's tried everything short of invasion, sanctions, sabotage, covert operations, even a failed assassination attempt on Maduro in 2018. But here's the it's not working. The US keeps doubling down on the same failed strategies: regime change, sanctions, isolation, and expecting different results. It's like watching a gambler at a casino who keeps losing but refuses to walk away. Why? Because the alternative, accepting that Venezuela is outside the U.S. sphere of influence, would mean admitting that American hegemony is over. And that's a truth Washington isn't ready to face. The military, the illusion of a quick fix. Now, let's talk about the military option. Because if there's one thing I've learned in my decades of studying U.S. foreign policy, it's the hawks are always wrong, but they're never in doubt. Every time the U.S. faces a geopolitical setback, the same voices start clamoring for military action. Just a few airstrikes, they say. A limited intervention. The Venezuelan people will welcome us as liberators. Sound familiar? It should. We heard the same thing before Iraq. Before Libya. Before Syria. And every time, the result is the chaos, destruction, and a power vacuum that gets filled by something far worse. Venezuela is no different. The U.S. has already tried covert action, sabotage, cyber attacks, mercenary invasions. None of it has worked. A full-scale invasion? That's a fantasy. Venezuela has a population of 28 million, a standing army of 120,000, and a well-armed militia of over 2 million. The terrain is mountainous and jungle-covered, perfect for guerrilla warfare. And let's not Russia and China have both warned that any US military action would trigger a response. Are we really prepared for a direct confrontation with Russia in the Caribbean? Even if the US somehow managed to overthrow Maduro, what then? The opposition is too divided to govern. The country is too fractured to hold together. We'd be looking at another Iraq, a failed state, a breeding ground for cartels and terrorists, and a humanitarian disaster on a scale we haven't seen since Syria. But the hawks don't care about that. They care about one sending a message. The message that no country, no matter how small, can defy the United States and get away with it. The problem? That message is outdated. The world has moved on. And the longer the US clings to the illusion of unipolar dominance, the more it risks a catastrophic miscalculation. The domestic political why this is about Florida, not democracy. Here's where it gets really cynical. Because while the US frames its Venezuela policy as a moral crusade, the reality is far more it's about domestic politics. Florida is the most important swing state in the country. And Florida's Latino vote, particularly the Venezuelan, Cuban, and Nicaraguan exile communities, is a key constituency. These communities hate socialism. They hate Maduro. They want regime change. And both parties know it. In 2020, Trump won Florida by just 371,000 votes. The Venezuelan American vote alone was larger than that margin. Biden, desperate to hold on to the state in 2024, has been under immense pressure to take a hard line on Venezuela. And so, despite his administration's initial attempts to ease tensions with Maduro, he's now back to the same old sanctions, recognition of the opposition, and threats of further action. It's not about democracy. It's not about human rights. It's about votes. And it's not just Biden. The entire foreign policy establishment is invested in this narrative. The think tanks, the media, the intelligence community, they all benefit from the idea that the US is the indispensable nation, the global policeman, the beacon of freedom. Admitting that Venezuela is a lost cause would mean admitting that the post-Cold War order is over. And that's a truth too painful for Washington to accept. Scenario: what comes next? So where does this go from here? Let's run through the possibilities. Scenario 1, the best case, a negotiated transition. In this scenario, the US and the opposition accept that Maduro isn't going anywhere and agree to a power-sharing deal. Sanctions are eased, Venezuela rejoins the global financial system, and the country begins a slow recovery. The problem? Neither side wants this. The opposition is too fragmented, the US is too invested in regime change, and Maduro isn't stupid enough to trust Washington's promises. The last time Venezuela tried this, in 2020, with the Barbados Accords, it collapsed within months. Scenario 2, the most likely, prolonged stalemate. This is where we are now. The US keeps tightening the screws, more sanctions, more covert action, more diplomatic isolation, but Maduro hangs on. Russia and China keep propping him up. The opposition remains divided. The economy stays in crisis, but the regime survives. This could go on for years, with Venezuela becoming a permanent failed state on America's doorstep. The only winners? The arms dealers, the sanctions lawyers, and the geopolitical strategists who profit from chaos. Scenario 3, the worst case, escalation to war. This is the scenario that keeps me up at night. The US, frustrated by its inability to remove Maduro, decides to up the ante. A naval blockade. Airstrikes on military targets. A full-scale invasion. Russia and China respond, perhaps not directly, but by arming Maduro's forces, sending more mercenaries, or even opening a second front in another part of the world. The result? A regional war that could spiral into a global conflict. And for what? To prove a point that no one cares about anymore. None of these scenarios are good. But the worst part? The US is choosing the path of maximum risk with no clear endgame. The grand strategy why America keeps losing. Let me be the United States is losing the geopolitical game because it's playing the wrong one. For the past 30 years, American foreign policy has been guided by a doctrine of liberal hegemony, the idea that the US can and should reshape the world in its image. Democracy promotion, regime change, military intervention, these aren't just tools of foreign policy, they're articles of faith. But here's the it doesn't work. Look at the record. Iraq? A disaster. Libya? A disaster. Syria? A disaster. Afghanistan? A disaster. Every time the US tries to impose its will on another country, it ends up creating more problems than it solves. And yet, the foreign policy establishment keeps doubling down on the same failed strategies. Why? Because the alternative, accepting that the world is multipolar, that other countries have their own interests, that the US can't control everything, is too painful to contemplate. It would mean admitting that the post-Cold War era is over. That America is no longer the sole superpower. That the 21st century belongs to a different kind of order, one where power is shared, where spheres of influence are respected, where the US is just one player among many. This isn't isolationism. It's realism. And it's the only way the US can avoid the fate of every other empire in overreach, decline, and collapse. What should we do instead? So what's the alternative? How should the US handle Venezuela and the broader challenge of a multipolar world? First, stop the regime change fantasies. Maduro isn't going anywhere. The sooner the US accepts that, the sooner it can start dealing with reality. Second, ease the sanctions. Not because Maduro deserves it, but because sanctions don't work. They hurt the people, not the regime. And they push Venezuela deeper into the arms of Russia and China. Third, engage in diplomacy. Not the kind of diplomacy where the US makes demands and expects compliance, but real diplomacy where both sides have something to gain. Venezuela needs investment. The US needs oil. There's room for a deal. Fourth, stop treating Latin America like a backyard. The Monroe Doctrine is dead. The US needs to accept that countries like Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua have the right to choose their own path even if we don't like it. Fifth, focus on domestic renewal. The biggest threat to American power isn't Venezuela or Russia or China. It's our own decay, our crumbling infrastructure, our political dysfunction, our economic inequality. If the US wants to remain a global leader, it needs to fix itself first. This isn't weakness. It's strategy. The lesson Venezuela teaches us. Venezuela found out the hard way what happens when a small country defies the global hegemon. It gets crushed. Sanctioned. Sabotaged. Isolated. And for what? For daring to chart its own course in a world where the US still believes it has the right to dictate the fate of nations. But here's the world is changing. The unipolar moment is over. The US can either adapt or be left behind. And if it keeps making the same mistakes, if it keeps clinging to the illusion of dominance, it will end up like every other empire, exhausted, overextended, and irrelevant. The question: will we learn the lesson before it's too late? Because Venezuela isn't the last country that's going to find out the hard way. It's just the first in a new era of great power competition. And if the US doesn't change course, it won't be the last to suffer. But here's the good: we, the people, can stop this. Informed citizens are the brake on government overreach. The more we question the official narrative, the harder it becomes for the establishment to drag us into another pointless conflict. So the next time you hear about Venezuela, ask who benefits from this story? Is it the Venezuelan people? Or is it the foreign policy blob, the defense contractors, the political operatives who profit from endless war? The answer might surprise you. And it might just save us all. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's story isn't just about oil or sanctions or even ideology, it's about the raw, unvarnished mechanics of power in the 21st century. And if we're honest, those mechanics have less to do with democracy or human rights than they do with something far: the ability to project force. Because when you strip away the rhetoric, what we're really watching is a case study in how a declining hegemon responds when its authority is challenged. And let me tell you, the playbook hasn't changed much since the British Empire was policing the high seas. Here's the uncomfortable: the United States didn't just stumble into this confrontation with Venezuela. It was a deliberate choice, one that reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of how power actually works in today's world. For decades, Washington operated under the assumption that economic coercion, sanctions, asset seizures, financial exclusion could replace military intervention. The logic was, why risk another Iraq when you could strangle a country's economy from the comfort of a Treasury Department office? But what they failed to account for was the resilience of targeted states, the rise of alternative financial systems, and most critically, the willingness of other major powers to step in and fill the void. Take the case of Russia and China. When the US imposed its first round of serious sanctions on Venezuela in 2017, freezing the country out of the US financial system and blocking its access to dollar-denominated markets, most analysts assumed Caracas would collapse within months. Instead, Moscow and Beijing did what great powers have always: they saw an opportunity. Russia's Rosneft stepped in as a lifeline, providing billions in loans secured by Venezuelan oil and even helping PDVSA, the state oil company, evade US sanctions by reflagging tankers and rerouting shipments. China, meanwhile, kept the lights on with billions more in loans, often repaid in oil at below-market rates. By 2019, Venezuela was exporting more oil to China than it had before the sanctions, just not to the US or its allies. This wasn't charity. It was geopolitics in its purest form. Both Russia and China understood something that Washington still struggles to in a multipolar world: economic warfare is only effective if you can enforce it unilaterally. And when other major economies refuse to play along, sanctions become little more than a nuisance. The US can freeze Venezuelan assets in New York, but it can't stop Caracas from trading in yuan or rubles. It can sanction PDVSA, but it can't prevent Russia from buying Venezuelan oil at a discount and reselling it to India or Malaysia. The dollar may still dominate global trade, but its power is no longer absolute. And every time the US weaponizes it, it accelerates the search for alternatives. Now, let's talk about the military dimension, because this is where things get really interesting and dangerous. The US has a long history of intervening in Latin America, from the Bay of Pigs to the overthrow of Allende in Chile. But in Venezuela, the playbook had to adapt. Direct military intervention was always a non-starter. The American public has no appetite for another forever war, and the political risks, both domestically and internationally, were too high. So instead, Washington pursued what I call hybrid warfare light, a mix of economic pressure, covert operations, and proxy forces designed to destabilize the government without leaving fingerprints. The most obvious example was the 2019 attempt to force humanitarian aid across the Colombian border, a stunt so transparently political that even the Red Cross refused to participate. The idea was to create a trucks full of supplies, blocked by Venezuelan troops, while the world watched and condemned Maduro as a tyrant. But the operation backfired spectacularly. The aid was minimal, the staging was amateurish, and when the trucks were set ablaze, it played right into Maduro's narrative of US aggression. More importantly, it revealed the limits of Washington's influence. Despite years of cajoling, bribing, and threatening, the Venezuelan military remained loyal to Maduro. And why wouldn't it? The generals weren't just defending an ideology, they were defending their own power, their own wealth, their own slice of the country's dwindling resources. But here's where it gets even more complicated. The US wasn't just relying on economic pressure and propaganda. There were also the covert operations, some acknowledged, some not. In 2020, the Trump administration indicted Maduro on drug trafficking charges, offering a $15 million bounty for his capture. That same year, a ragtag group of mercenaries, including 2 former U.S. Special Forces soldiers, launched an ill-fated invasion attempt known as Operation Gideon. The plan was to infiltrate Venezuela, capture Maduro, and install Juan Guaidó as president. It was a farce, a Keystone Cops operation that ended with the mercenaries either captured or killed within hours. But it wasn't just incompetence. It was a sign of desperation. Because here's the thing about hybrid: it only works if you have local partners who are actually capable of seizing power. And in Venezuela, the opposition is deeply divided, corrupt, and utterly lacking in popular support. Guaidó, the man Washington anointed as Venezuela's legitimate president, couldn't even fill a Caracas plaza for a rally. Meanwhile, Maduro, for all his flaws, still controlled the military, the courts, and the streets. The US could sanction, it could sabotage, it could even try to assassinate. But without a viable alternative, it was all just noise. And that brings me to the real lesson here, the one that Washington still refuses to learn. Power isn't just about coercion. It's about legitimacy. The US can bomb a country into the Stone Age, but if it doesn't have a plan for what comes next, it just creates a vacuum. And in that vacuum, someone else will step in. In Venezuela, that someone was Russia and China. In Syria, it was Russia and Iran. In Afghanistan, it was the Taliban. The pattern is that the US overestimates its ability to shape outcomes from afar, underestimates the resilience of its adversaries, and then watches as its interventions backfire spectacularly. Now, you might be fine, but what's the alternative? Should the US just let dictators like Maduro do whatever they want? Of course not. But there's a difference between holding bad actors accountable and waging economic warfare that punishes ordinary people while enriching the very elites you claim to oppose. Sanctions on Venezuela didn't topple Maduro, they just made life hell for the average Venezuelan while the generals and the oligarchs found ways to profit. And that's the dirty little secret of modern. They're not precision weapons. They're blunt instruments that hurt the weakest the most. So where does that leave us? If the US wants to remain a relevant global power, it needs to accept a few hard truths. First, the era of unchallenged American dominance is over. Russia and China aren't going away, and they're not going to stop pushing back against US hegemony. Second, economic coercion is a tool, not a strategy. It can buy time, but it can't force regime change. And third, the US needs to stop outsourcing its foreign policy to think tanks, defense contractors, and exiled opposition figures with no real constituency. But most importantly, the US needs to stop seeing every challenge to its authority as an existential threat. Venezuela isn't a threat to American security. Neither is Cuba, nor Nicaragua, nor even Iran. These are regional powers with limited reach, and the more the US treats them like mortal enemies, the more it reinforces their narrative of American imperialism. That doesn't mean ignoring abuses or turning a blind eye to aggression. It means engaging with the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. Because here's the harder the US pushes against Venezuela, the more it strengthens Maduro's hand. Every new sanction, every failed coup attempt, every inflammatory speech from a US official just gives him another excuse to crack down, to rally his base, to paint himself as the defender of Venezuelan sovereignty. And in the process, the US becomes the villain in the story, not just for Venezuelans, but for much of the global South. So the next time you hear some pundit on cable news demanding tougher action against Venezuela, ask what's the endgame here? Is it really about democracy? Or is it about maintaining the illusion of control in a world that no longer wants to be controlled? Because if it's the latter, then we're not just failing Venezuela. We're failing ourselves. Now, what most people don't realize is that this dynamic isn't just playing out on the international stage, it's tearing Venezuela apart from the inside, and the way the domestic political landscape is evolving should make even the most hardened regime change optimists reconsider their assumptions. Because while Washington fixates on Maduro's survival as a failure of US policy, the reality is that Venezuela's political system has undergone a quiet but profound transformation over the past decade, one that makes the old binary of democracy versus dictatorship look increasingly obsolete. Let me explain why this matters. When Hugo Chavez first came to power in 1998, Venezuela's political system was still, at least nominally, a functioning democracy. The opposition was fragmented, yes, but it had institutional channels, elections, courts, a legislature to challenge the government. Chavez dismantled those channels systematically, but he did so while maintaining a veneer of legitimacy through repeated electoral victories. Maduro inherited that system, but he's taken it in a different direction. Where Chavez relied on charisma and oil-funded patronage, Maduro has built something far more a hybrid regime that combines authoritarian control with just enough democratic trappings to keep the opposition guessing. Here's the uncomfortable: Venezuela today isn't Cuba. It's not North Korea. It's not even Nicaragua. It's a country where elections still happen, just not the kind that lead to meaningful change. Take the 2024 presidential vote, for example. The opposition, after years of infighting and U.S. meddling, finally coalesced around a single candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez, a former diplomat with no political base of his own. The regime, in turn, allowed the election to proceed, but only after disqualifying Maria Corina Machado, the opposition's most popular figure, on dubious legal grounds. The result? A landslide for Maduro, but one that was so transparently rigged that even some of his allies in the region, like Brazil's Lula, refused to recognize it outright. But here's where it gets interesting. The opposition's strategy of betting everything on a single election, what I've called the all-in electoralism approach, has failed before. In 2018, they boycotted the vote, only to see Maduro win unopposed. In 2020, they participated in legislative elections, only to be trounced by a government that gerrymandered the hell out of the electoral map. And in 2024, they ran a candidate who, by all accounts, was a placeholder for Machado, only to watch the regime pull out all the stops to ensure his defeat. The pattern is when the opposition plays by the rules change. When they don't play by the rules, they get crushed. So what's the alternative? That's the million-dollar question, and it's one that the opposition and its backers in Washington have never satisfactorily answered. The hardliners in the U.S. and among the Venezuelan diaspora still cling to the fantasy of a military coup or a popular uprising, but the reality is that the Venezuelan military is more fractured than it's ever been. The high command is deeply corrupt, yes, but it's also deeply invested in the status quo. The lower ranks, meanwhile, are suffering just like everyone else, but they're not about to risk their lives for a political class that has repeatedly failed them. And that's the other piece of this puzzle that gets the Venezuelan people are exhausted. Not just by hyperinflation, not just by the collapse of public services, but by the endless cycle of hope and betrayal. In 2019, when Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president with U.S. backing, millions took to the streets. 5 years later, Guaidó is a footnote, and the protests have dwindled to a trickle. Why? Because people don't just want regime change, they want a functioning state. And the opposition has never offered a credible plan for how to get there. Now, let's talk about the regime's survival strategy, because it's more sophisticated than most give it credit for. Maduro's inner circle, figures like Diosdado Cabello, Tarek El Aissami, and the ever-present Delcy Rodriguez have spent the last decade perfecting what political scientists call competitive authoritarianism. They don't need to win fair elections, they just need to make sure the opposition can't win at all. And they've done that by weaponizing every tool at the courts, the Electoral Council, the intelligence services, even the media. But here's they're not invincible. The regime's Achilles heel has always been its economic incompetence. Despite sitting on the world's largest oil reserves, Venezuela's GDP has contracted by nearly 80% since 2013. The bolivar is worthless. The country's infrastructure is crumbling. And yet, Maduro has managed to avoid total collapse through a combination of dollarization, smuggling, and sheer brute force. The question is, how long can that last? The answer depends on 3 factors. First, oil prices. Venezuela's economy is still, fundamentally, a petrostate, and if crude prices stay above $70 a barrel, Maduro can keep the lights on. Second, regional dynamics. The thaw in relations with Colombia and Brazil under Gustavo Petro and Lula has given Maduro some breathing room, but if those governments fall or shift rightward, the pressure could return. And third, the opposition's ability to adapt. If they keep betting everything on elections, they'll keep losing. But if they start building a real grassroots movement, one that addresses the day-to-day needs of Venezuelans, rather than just the abstract promise of democracy, they might have a chance. But that's a big if. The opposition is still dominated by a handful of elite figures who have spent more time in Miami than in the barrios of Caracas. They talk about unity, but they can't even agree on whether to participate in elections or boycott them. And they've outsourced their strategy to Washington, which has its own agenda, one that doesn't always align with the interests of ordinary Venezuelans. So where does that leave us? In a stalemate, at least for now. Maduro isn't going anywhere, but neither is the opposition. The country is stuck in a kind of purgatory, where the regime survives by default because the alternatives are either too weak or too unpalatable. And the longer this goes on, the more Venezuela risks becoming a failed state, not in the sense of Somalia or Libya, but in the sense of a country that exists in name only, where the government controls the capital but the rest of the country operates in a kind of parallel reality. Here's the final thought I'll leave you: Venezuela's crisis isn't just a failure of US policy. It's a failure of the entire international system. The UN has been useless. The OAS is a relic. The Lima Group collapsed under its own contradictions. And the US, for all its bluster, has never had a coherent strategy beyond sanctions and regime change rhetoric. The result is a country that's been abandoned to its fate, where the only winners are the corrupt elites who profit from the chaos. So the next time someone asks you what's going to happen in Venezuela, tell them that no one knows. Not the pundits, not the diplomats, not even Maduro himself. But one thing is, the old playbook isn't working. And if we keep pretending it is, we're not just failing Venezuela. We're failing to learn anything at all.